Hi, I'm Davy. I'm awesome. And welcome to Davy's Awesome Wrestling, where I review wrestling-related things all from the perspective of a fan, not an insider. A few months ago, I started reviewing the docuseries The Monday Night Wars. I reviewed episodes 1 through 10. We're going to finish it off with episodes 11 through 20. So episode 11, Monday Night Jericho. It's basically the story of Chris Jericho, starting with before WCW, his time in ECW, then going to WCW, trying to make something of himself, not being allowed. He was not happy. Because like a lot of guys in WCW, he was not allowed to get past a certain point on the card. They were relying way too much on the old-timers, not really elevating new stars. It's one of the things that definitely killed WCW. So, because of his frustrations with WCW, he went to WWE, making the best debut that I think has ever actually happened. The countdown to the moment of his debut in the middle of The Rock's promo. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was an awesome night. But then went into right after that in WWE, he was actually kind of stagnant until he actually started getting over, and then eventually became the first ever undisputed champion. It was a good episode, but if you've seen a Chris Jericho documentary or read any of his books, you've heard the story. Episode 12, The War Gets Electrified. This one focusing on The Rock. How he wanted to get into WWE, but at first he did not want to be called Rocky Maivia. And then his debut at Survivor Series, dressed in blue because he was the blue chipper. But how at first he was a white meat babyface that nobody really liked because he was just too, Boy Scoutish. And through this, he's doing everything right, but he's getting frustrated. People hate him. So they give him a chance to turn heel by joining the Nation of Domination. And it worked for him because it gave him a chance to really shine and eventually take over the Nation of Domination, making it all about The Rock. And then it goes into his legendary feuds with Triple H, Mankind, of course Stone Cold Steve Austin. But basically, again, kind of like with the Jericho episode, if you've seen any documentaries about The Rock, you've heard this story many times. Episode 13, Divas Gone Wild. Don't get too excited, Josh. It ain't like that. Basically, an episode dedicated to the role that the women played during the Monday Night Wars. How it started with Alundra Blaze, who left WWF as the WWF Women's Champion because that division was basically so poorly handled that they kind of forgot about it, and she just left. Went back to WCW as Medusa, and there was that infamous moment where she took the WWF Women's Championship live on Nitro and threw it in the trash, insulting the WWF. But then later, we started getting the women that would later be referred to as divas, like Sunny, Terry Runnels, of course Sable. But their role was basically to be hot women walking down the ring with guys. They even mentioned Chyna coming along, being like an enforcer for Triple H, because she was a big girl. But as the popularity of these women were growing in WWF, WCW's response was the Nitro Girls. Which I never got that into either. I was just like, okay, you got cheerleaders. Woo! But because of the rising popularity of the women in WWF at the time, by '98, they decided to finally bring back the Women's Championship. And it has stayed back since. Unlike before that, it would come and go periodically. It has stayed since '98. Not only that, but they started putting some real emphasis on the women actually learning how to wrestle and actually be entertaining in the ring. Which, since then, I will say there's been times the quality of women's wrestling has dropped. But if it hadn't been for this time, it wouldn't have risen again to what it is now, which is a very legit division. And they emphasized a lot on two of the women that had the most to do with that around that time, Lita and Trish. But WCW was still not getting it. They had a women's title for about a year at that point. Actually, 2 women's titles for about a year at that point, but most people don't even remember they ever existed. Episode 14, The Foundations of War. Episodes focusing on 2 of the iconic mainstays of both the WWF and WCW, Sting and The Undertaker. Basically going through the career of Sting and the career of The Undertaker, how the two of them rose, became iconic in their brands, and not only iconic, but extremely loyal. Both of them stuck it out through thick and thin in either one of their companies. Sting staying with WCW even until his demise. And then took a very long time to go to WWE and work there for even a little bit. In fact, so long that by the time this docuseries came out, he still hadn't gone to WWE. But in this docuseries, this was actually a treat at the time when it first came out because they were finally really talking about Sting and acknowledging Sting. It was almost like before then they were just kind of letting his memory fade away. He was an impact at the time, but they were like, you know what, let's acknowledge Sting and what he did for WCW. and what a loyal person he was, even until WCW fell. So I will say, whereas a lot of the episodes in this docuseries were very redundant, this one was actually a breath of fresh air. It was nice to have a comparison of two people that we always wanted to see get in the ring together, The Undertaker and Sting. And it's kind of sad that when WWE later finally had that opportunity, they still never gave it to us. Episode 15, The War Goes Mainstream. First focusing on how WWF realized that they had to get rid of the cartoonish gimmicks and start bringing in people that were legit athletes. Guys like Olympic weightlifter Mark Henry and UFC fighter Ken Shamrock. As WCW was doing that, they were bringing in guys like Dennis Rodman, a basketball player who was on a team that had won the NBA championships. WWF also started emphasizing more to the people watching at home the legit athletic backgrounds of these athletes. For example, they started going into Farouk and the fact that he was a football player, one that had his jersey retired, he was an All-American, all that kind of stuff. And even to get mainstream and get eyes on the product, they were talking about how WWF for WrestleMania 14 brought in Mike Tyson, who at the time was not just the most famous boxer, but he was basically one of the biggest celebrities out there at the time. I remember being around at the time and everybody was talking about Tyson, even before he bit Evander Holyfield's ear. And Bret Hart even talking about how Mike Tyson originally wanted to do something with WCW and Eric Bischoff passed on that. And I bet you're kicking yourself for that now, because that did get so many new eyes on the product. WCW's response to that, not only bringing back Dennis Rodman, but bringing back his NBA rival at the time, Karl Malone. The two of them being in a tag team match. Rodman teaming with Hollywood Hogan, Karl Malone teaming with DDP. And it was actually a pretty good match. But then WCW went another way with it, bringing in Jay Leno. Really didn't help them at all. It brought some eyes on the product, but it made it look ridiculous. But all this was getting the wrestlers mainstream notice. They were being featured on places like MTV and Saturday Night Live. They were making movies. They then brought in Kurt Angle, the first ever professional wrestler who was also an Olympic gold medalist in wrestling. And WCW really trying to be mainstream by making their own movie, Ready to Rumble. A movie that I have reviewed. A movie that I love, mostly because of how bad it is. It didn't do well. But then, trying to capitalize that and promote their movie, they gave the star of the movie, David Arquette, the WCW World Championship, which really was a killer blow. As much as Vince Russo, who was even on this documentary bragging about it got us on the front paper of the USA Today, it hurt more than it helped. Because as whereas it got a few eyes on the product that night, a lot of fans stopped watching at that point, including me. And it's one of the reasons I don't like Vince Russo, is because to this day, he insults our intelligence. His biggest excuse behind that is, I can't believe that many people thought wrestling was real. Screw you, Vince Russo. We know it's not real, but you insulted our intelligence. How about you just admit it was a bad call? Episode 16, Building an Army. Talking about how WCW was building themselves a roster of WWF guys. It really was a problem with WCW. They didn't make very many people. They made Goldberg, they made Sting, but that's really about it. Everybody else they ever brought in, they got from WWF, so they were already big. And doing that, of course, they formed the NWO, their one really great idea. And WWF's counter to that, instead of forming a big faction, they formed many factions. Which was cool. I kind of wish we had more factions going on today, like they did back then. When they had like the Hart Foundation, the Nation of Domination, Los Boricuas, DX. And how WCW's roster got so big that they decided to create Thunder. A B show that most of the big names would not work on it, which was how Thunder felt. It was like a filler show where all the people that nobody cared about went on to. Versus WWF's counter to that was SmackDown, where all the roster could be. And when things started going downward for WCW, they just tried to reinforce the NWO, which wasn't a good move because people were getting tired of the NWO. It had gotten stale. And WCW wasn't taking care of their guys, so people like The Giant decided to leave, go to WWF, where he became the Big Show. Became a much bigger name than he ever was in WCW. Another thing WWF did that SmackDown allowed them was more time to promote their tag teams. WCW was very bad at promoting their tag teams. WWF was starting to promote their tag teams, and man, did they have some great tag teams back then. The Hardys, the Dudleys, Edge and Christian, Too Cool, the Headbangers, the New Age Outlaws. I could go on and on. They had so many great tag teams back then. Probably the best time for tag team wrestling ever. And then over to WCW, who realized that they had made a mistake, focusing too much on the older talent, started trying to build up new, fresh talent. But by then it was too late. Episode 17, The Click. An entire episode focusing on The Click. Sean Waltman, Razor Ramon, Diesel, Shawn Michaels, Triple H. How they became friends and how these individuals were actually becoming the biggest names in WWF. And then WCW, through the allure of money and guaranteed contracts, got Razor Ramon and Diesel, who went over there as Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, and of course formed the MWO. And of course went into how the last night that Diesel and Razor Ramon were there was the infamous curtain call. The moment at Madison Square Garden, where even though it was out of character, which was not done back then, 4 of them, Diesel, Razor Ramon, Shawn Michaels, and Hunter Hearst Helmsley, got into the ring together, hugged, and bowed to the crowd. Basically letting the crowd know, yeah, by the way, this is all an act. As if wrestling fans really didn't know by then. But it did cause a lot of problems. A lot of people in the back were not happy about it. Diesel and Razor Ramon were going to WCW. Shawn Michaels was the champion, so who had to take all the punishment? Triple H. He was supposed to win that year's King of the Ring, but he ended up losing. And the winner of that year was Austin, which was the birth of the Austin 316 thing, which is what set him on a path to becoming the biggest name, arguably ever in wrestling. But from there, eventually Triple H and Shawn Michaels, they formed DX, which was kind of a counter to NWO. It was edgy, it was cool. Some people try to say it was a copy of NWO. I don't agree there. They didn't get the size of NWO, not to mention NWO was more like a gang where these were just, well, what they called themselves, degenerates. Either way, it was cool and it was edgy and it was something WWF needed. But then, of course, Shawn Michaels, he got hurt, he injured his back. That put him out of action for almost 5 years. So, Sean Waltman comes back to WWF as X-Pac, not to mention they grab the New Age Outlaw, and they reinvent DX, and it became one of the biggest factions in wrestling history. I mean, it already was, but it came even bigger. Then it goes into, like, basically Hall and Nash not really caring in WCW, Kevin Nash becoming the booker and not doing very good booking, and till WCW went under, and goes into how the Clique all ended up back in the WWF at some point. Episode 18, Mistakes on the Battlefield. Going into mostly WCW's mistakes. Like how Eric Bischoff was constantly burying Ric Flair. He used him to get Hogan and Randy Savage into WCW, and then basically just kept casting him aside, insulting him, saying he doesn't draw, which to any wrestling fan is like one of the most ridiculous things you could hear, that Ric Flair never draws money. But again, one of WCW's biggest mistakes, one of their biggest downfalls, was the failure to build new talent. They were putting so much emphasis on all these guys that had already made names for themselves elsewhere that they ignored all the people that needed to be built up in their own organization. Which is, again, a mistake that makes you wonder, like, how could you not think about that? Wrestling's entertainment, and any form of entertainment, you got to keep things new and exciting. Another one of their big blunders was announcing on their own television show that a pre-taped WWF Raw was going to have Mick Foley win the World Championship, thinking that people wouldn't turn over there if they knew that that was going to happen. And it very, very backfired. Because over 500,000 people immediately switched channels from WCW to WWF because they wanted to see history be made. And then another infamous moment for WCW, the finger poke of doom. Because remember when Nash let Hogan touch him on the chest so he could fall down and let Hogan beat him for the championship, which kills the legitimacy of a championship when you just give it to somebody else. And because of this and the staggering numbers of WCW going downward and downward, Eric Bischoff was sent home. And it ends there, going into the next episode, which I actually like. The first 3 episodes of this documentary all seem to tie in together to tell the story, and same with the last 3. In between there, a lot of it just seemed like little mini 1-hour documentaries. But episode 19, The Fall of WCW, picking up from where the last one had left off. With Vince Russo, who at the time was writing for WWF, was very responsible for the beginning of the Attitude Era. Everybody wants to credit him for the entire thing. He only was there for the very beginning of it. But Vince Russo took over and started writing WWF like it was the Jerry Springer Show, and it worked. It got people watching the WWF. So WCW offered him a big contract to come and have sole creative control over WCW. And it had Vince Russo saying he had to do it because it was a challenge and blah, blah, blah. Bull. I think he did it because it was a lot of money and he could do whatever he wanted. Versus in WWF, he had Vince McMahon as a filter. And it didn't work because his ideas weren't gaining any traction. In fact, they were just continuing WCW on their downward spiral. And I will say this, that WCW, their executives wanted instant results. It's not really how it works. So they sent Vince Russo home and allowed Kevin Sullivan to take over creative control. But Problem there were some people who did not trust him. And in this documentary, they mention that. They talk about the Radicals leaving WCW and going to WWF. But they clearly leave out the reason they didn't trust Kevin Sullivan. But since this wasn't working, a few months later, they decided to bring back both Russo and Eric Bischoff to work together. And that was freaking horrible. Because the first thing they did was a title reboot. Which I remember hearing about that and going, are you serious? That is stupid. Because it kind of kills the legitimacy of a championship. If a championship is vacated because a champion gets injured, that doesn't hurt the legitimacy of the championship. But if a championship is vacated because they went, oh, okay, well, if you told me to, here you go. Kind of hurts the legitimacy of a championship. Then, of course, they went into the Bash of the Beach incident where Hogan wanted to win and using his creative control. In the documentary, he says that that was the first time he ever exercised his creative control, to which I believe about as much as I believe the single bullet theory. But, of course, Vince Russo making Jeff Jarrett lay down for Hulk Hogan to piss him off and get him out of there, and then later have Booker T win the championship that night. And then, of course, they let Vince Russo go for good. And, of course, Vince Russo won't admit that any of his ideas were bad. He never does. He says that he was just put in a situation where he was doomed to fail, which, okay, I gave him that for a time. But then he went and started writing for TNA, and, well, we see some of his great ideas that happened in those early days. Sorry, but Vince Russo, like Eric Bischoff, was a one-trick pony, and it worn out. Not to mention, that's one thing I also hate about Vince Russo. Everything good that happens, he takes credit for. Anything bad that happens was not his fault. And then it goes into the AOL Time Warner merger and how they wanted to sell WCW, and Eric Bischoff, with some investors, was going to buy it. And then it ends there until it goes into the next episode. Which brings us to the final episode, episode 20, Life After Wartime, where it talks about, Eric Bischoff and his investors ended up pulling out of the final deal because AOL Time Warner made it clear that not only were they going to get rid of WCW as their company, but they were not going to have it airing on TNT or TBS. And without a network for it to air on, it was not worth anything. And who bought it for a very cheap price just to get the video library was Vince McMahon. And after that, they go into the invasion angle, which didn't work out because, let's face it, a bunch of the top stars from WCW did not come along with it. They had guaranteed contracts to get paid sitting at home because their contracts were through AOL Time Warner, not WCW. And then after the invasion angle, when all the stars finally did start coming back, they brought in the NWO. They even later brought in Bischoff to be the general manager of Raw. Which none of those things were things that I really cared for back then, but it basically just all came full circle. The war was over, and WWE now was the only thing really going on in wrestling outside of like indie promotions and stuff. Now we're at a time where there's some competition again, and it's once again an exciting time to be a wrestling fan. So that is the docuseries, The Monday Night Wars. WWE versus WCW. As far as my opinion on the entire docuseries, it's kind of cool and kind of nostalgic as a fan, but as a fan, if you're the kind of fan that watches this stuff to begin with, most of this is extremely redundant. When they go into the profile things of like Goldberg and Steve Austin and The Rock and Chris Jericho, or the birth of the NWO, or the Clique, it's stuff we've heard over and over again before. Not to mention every show ending with WCW's demise, the beginning and ending of every episode starts to get redundant. And most of these do not tie in together. Out of the 20 episodes, 6 of them tie in together. Meaning 14 are just like little 1-hour documentaries, whereas the first 3 episodes, they all tie in together to tell the rise and fall of WCW, and the final 3, the final days of WCW, which again in and of itself was kind of cool to get a little bit more detail, but we pretty much already knew. Like I said, throughout the entire docuseries, if you haven't heard these stories already, like you're a new fan that maybe wasn't around back then I recommend you check this out. If you're a nostalgia person like me, sure, check it out. It's entertaining enough. But for the most part, don't expect to hear something you haven't heard before. So like I said, I recommend checking it out. It's on the WWE Network, but it's not essential. So there you have it. That's my wrestling review this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to hit like. Hit subscribe, hit the little bell so you get notifications for when I post new videos, and leave a comment. Tell me what you thought of the Monday Night Wars, WWE versus WCW. Love you guys.